invite you to stay tuned for the live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study of the Mayfield Drive Baptist Church, located at 271 Mayfield Drive, Smyrna, Tennessee. We will now join the service.
Well, we welcome you back again for our Wednesday evening Bible study here at Mayfield Drive. And we are concluding this evening a church history beyond the trail of blood, a short history of Baptists in America. Now, I have made this into a manuscript, and eventually it will be published, and then not only in print, but also in ebook form so that it can be downloaded. There'll be some more material in that book and in that manuscript that's not in here, but we will be concluding this evening our study of the church history through the trail of blood. This will be the last one. So we'll now take a look at the churches that were started in Maine and South Carolina. You say, why those two together? The two were interconnected in their beginnings, and here we will see why. Again, we reference Newman as our source of information. So now let's look at the First Baptists of Maine and South Carolina. In January 1682, excuse me, the Boston Baptist Church received a letter written on the behalf of a body of Baptists who had gathered themselves for Christian worship at Kittery in the province of Maine by Humphrey Churchwood, and born, it would seem, by one of the members of this body, William Scriven by name. So the Boston Brethren were not slow to respond to this request. Now, Maine province was still part of Massachusetts at that time. It had not become a separate state as yet. Right, broken free is a good term for it. So 8 days after Churchwood's letter was written, the Boston Church issued the following certificate signed by Isaac Hull and John Farnham. Quote, to all whom it may concern, these are to certify that our beloved brother William Scriven is a member in communion with us, and having had trial of his gifts among us, and finding him to be a man whom God hath qualified and furnished with the gifts of his Holy Spirit and grace, enabling him to open and to apply the Word of God, which through the blessing of the Lord Jesus may be useful in his hand for the begetting and building up of souls in the knowledge of God. Do therefore appoint, approve, and encourage him to exercise his gift in the place where he lives, or elsewhere, as the providence of God may cast him, and so the Lord help him to eye his glory in all things, and to walk humbly in the fear of his name. Now that entire paragraph was one sentence. Grant, I challenge you to diagram this one. Yeah, a couple of pieces of paper. That's what it would take. I'll be honest with you. I couldn't do it. And I've taught English and English composition for. I couldn't diagram this thing. I don't know enough about English, believe it or not, to be able to diagram it. All right. From Churchwood's letter, it seems evident that a body of baptized believers had already been organized and had appointed Scriven to the pastoral office. But they did not consider themselves competent to administer the ordinances until their minister-elect should have received ordination at the hands of a regular constituted church, and until the new organization should have organized by an older. It is probable that most or all of those who joined in the Kittery organization had been members of Baptist churches in England. It is highly probable that the pastor of the Kittery Church is identical with the William Scriven, who, as a representative of the Somerton Church, was among the signers of the Confession of Faith of several churches of Christ in the county of Somerset, England, and of some churches in the counties near adjacent, unquote, set forth in 1656. Now, as he was born about 1629, he was 25 years of age at the time. So, in other words, he was old enough to be able to be this one whom they were talking. The fact that the settlement affected him in South Carolina was named Somerton would go far toward establishing this identification. But the supposition that it was his father who signed the confession would meet the case equally well. It is almost certain that he was a member of the Somerton Church. The following year he was married to a daughter of Robert Cutts. Okay. I'm sorry. I was reading what was on the screen there. Excuse me. Yeah, it jumped a slide. It will do that every once in a while if you just linger too long on that button. The date of his arrival in Maine is unknown, but it must have been at some time previous to November 15, 1673, when his name appears in a deed at Kittery. The following year, he was married to a daughter of Robert Cutts, a prosperous shipbuilder, one of whose brothers was the first president of New Hampshire. This would seem to have been Scriven's second marriage, as the son of his, named William, was a member of the General Court in 1694. As early as 1675, we find him presented by a grand jury, quote, for not frequenting the public meeting according to law on the Lord's day, unquote. It was shown, however, that he attended another meeting of the established religion. Now, just to refresh our memories, if you did not go to church where you were supposed to go to church. It wasn't the church that decided anything against you. It was the local magistrate. The local government did the church's business for them. Absolutely. And we've come full circle just about. After serving in a number of public offices, he was appointed a deputy from Kittery in 1681. Now, I know some of you have been to Kittery and know where Kittery is, but Kittery is right down in the southeastern tip of Maine, very close to New Hampshire. So it's then Kittery, and then you go into, if you went west, you'd go into Massachusetts or New Hampshire. If you went south, you entered Massachusetts. So it's right there in that. Well, yeah. You'd have to go over some to get in Massachusetts. But anyway, potatoes. Yeah, that's, hear me. Scriven apparently did not go to Kittery as soon as he could, because Churchwood on the 25th of January wrote to the church in Boston that because of Scriven's absence, the local magistrate was threatening the church with fines and other penalties. Yeah. Yes. Because that Scriven did not go and take his position and be ordained and take his position as pastor, the local magistrates began to harass the congregation. Shortly after this, Scriven returned to Kittery, and it was not but a short time that he was summoned to court. He was required to furnish a bond of 100 pounds. That was a lot of money at that time. But he refused to give it, resulting in his being jailed. Good question. On April the 12th, he was again in court at York. This time, he was fined another 10 pounds and, quote, forbidden to hold any further meetings in the province, and ordered to conform in religious matters to the laws here established in the province upon such penalties as the law requires upon his neglect of the premises. In other words, you will preach what we tell you to preach, or you don't preach at all. That's what it amounted to. He was further ordered by the court to refrain from pastoring the church and to leave the province. There was no time set for his departure. Now, what I didn't put into your notes is that probably part of his time delay in leaving Kittery was because he had business interests in Kittery, as well as the church. So it wasn't like he could just, after they ordered him, go home and pack and leave. It was a complicated situation. Just like it would be for us if suddenly we were ordered to leave. Well, Every one of us has got something tied up with something that would prohibit us in going home and packing our bags and permanently leaving. It just couldn't be done. Pardon? You think you can? Well, here's the thing. If we did that, somebody else would have to take care of things. All right, he requested that the Boston church send a delegation to Kittery to organize the church. Yes, you're ostracized from basically the community. No. It was a mess. Now, this seemed to have been accomplished on September the 25th, 1682. It's believed that Scriven and his associates left for South Carolina at the end of 1682 or the beginning of 1683. They formed a settlement on the Cooper River, which would later become the town of Charleston, South Carolina. All right, we go back to Albert Newman. If the later date, which the public records of the province of Maine seem to fix for the departure of Scriven, be accepted, he at once exchanged the harassments of Maine for a delightful and promising field of labor. In any case, he soon found himself surrounded by a considerable number of sympathetic and highly influential souls, with freedom to exercise his ministry according to the dictates of his conscience. About 1683, a colony of North Britons came to Carolina under the patronage of Lord Cardross. They are said to have been mostly Baptists. They settled on Port Royal Island and claimed independence of the Charleston court. In other words, they said, we are not under you, you have nothing to do with us, and we have nothing to do with you. Having failed to sustain this claim, Lord Cardross returned to England, and the population, being exposed to the hostilities of Indians and Spaniards, removed before 1686, thank you, to the mouth of the Edisto River. Now, remember, the Spaniards were in Florida and Georgia, true. Yeah. So the Spaniards was a problem as well, because the Spaniards would raid these other places, communities. The Baptist part of the company became members of Scriven's church at Somerton. This, from many quarters, in the providence of God, a considerable band of zealous Baptists, many of them influentially connected, was gathered in the neighborhood of Charleston. By 1693, a large portion of the members of the church had been driven by the growing commercial importance of Charleston to take up their residence there. And it was thought wise to transfer their meeting to the town. Until they built a house of worship, they, quote, held their worship at the house of one William Chapman in King Street, unquote. The lot on which the present building stands was presented to the church in 1699 by William Elliot. Now, present time, this is Newman writing, this would have been somewhere around, since his history is copyrighted in 1894, it was probably 1892, 1893 when he was writing this. So that would have been, what, almost 200 years. The Baptists were among the first to occupy this region with organized Christian work. In other words, they were the first to go out and witness, all right, and try to win people to the Lord and follow through with the commission, Great Commission. In 1700, just as the Baptists were entering their new meeting house, they adopted the Confession of Faith set forth in 1689. The ministers and messengers of and concerned for upwards of 100 congregations in England and Wales, denying Arminianism. And by reason of its subsequent adoption, with slight modifications, by the Philadelphia Association. We've heard that term before, have we not? Known in America as the Philadelphia Confession. There was at this time a dearth of gospel privileges in Carolina outside of Charleston and its vicinity. In other words, there wasn't many. The colony had a population of about 5,500. That's a good-sized town, of whom 3,000 were residents of Charleston. Outside of Charleston, there is said to have been at that date no house of worship and no school. The Baptists were easily foremost in evangelical zeal. Scriven, though advanced in age, was abundant in labors, and the Charleston church sent forth of its own numbers and procured from other communities those who carried the gospel to the neglected planters. Now, what this is the plantations that were isolated and they were off by themselves, and there was not much intercommunication between them because they were huge and populated by slaves, and so there wasn't a lot of intermingling, I guess you would say, or it was too far for them to go to be able to go to the church. So what this church did is they sent people to them. Mission work, yes, it was. The English Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts furnished a number of missionaries from 1707 onward, but they found that in most cases they had been preceded by the Baptists. And there you see Newman's references. Yes, sir. Oh, yes. And he touches on this. Aged, infirm, and possessed of a competency, Scriven laid down the duties of the pastorate in 1706 and retired to his farm where Georgetown now stands. He left with the church as a memento and a guide and ornament for church members. Ornament for church members, which was printed after his death. In conclusion, he urged the church to secure, with as little delay as possible, an able and faithful minister. He said, be sure you take care of that person, that the person be orthodox in the faith and of a blameless life, and does own the confession of faith put forth by our brethren in London in 1689. But his evangelical zeal was too great to allow him to be idle. We soon find him laboring earnestly in the regions round about his home. The church secured the services of Mr. White, an English Baptist minister who died after a brief term of service. Or you could say, man, this church was sure hard on preachers. Scriven was just considering an invitation. Now here he is in his 80s, okay? Considering an invitation to the pastorate of the Boston church, but was constrained to resume his work in Charleston. All right? The pastor died, so now he's going back to fill in. He died at his Georgetown home, October the 10th, 1713, at the advanced age of, get this, 84. Yeah, it's a little old now, too. He left the church a strong body with a membership of nearly 100. A large number of preaching stations had been established, and the Negro population, already becoming relatively large, had doubtless already been brought to a considerable extent under the influence of the gospel. The population of the province had increased to about 15,000, of whom rather more than half were slaves. The fresh and fertile soil was yielding rich returns to the application of slave labor. Lumber was abundant and marketable. The sea abounded in valuable fish, and commercial prosperity gladdened the hearts of the colonists. Culture and refinement went hand in hand with abundance and leisure, and the foundations were being laid for the brilliant political and religious history of the succeeding time, and also, alas, for more recent disasters. Now, let's go to Virginia. We leave Maine and South Carolina behind and go to a new state. The history of Virginia Baptist had barely a beginning in the present period. Now, what Newman is talking about in present period is the first part of his work that he set aside from 1629 to 1740. That was the time that he was covering. Okay? 1629 to 1740. Now, I put this in writing later on, all right? But I wanted to give you what the time period that he was referring to. Virginia was settled by thoroughgoing churchmen. The Church of England was established. The support of its ministers amply provided at the public expense. The people were compelled under severe penalties to participate regularly in the church services and to subject themselves to catechol. Say that again? Catechol. Catechetical. Okay, whatever. Catechetical instructions. Okay. Dissenting services of any kind were rigorously prohibited. Heavy fines were imposed on ship owners for bringing in dissenters. In other words, Baptists, Mennonites, and anybody who wasn't part of the established church, yes. And the people were prohibited under heavy penalties from harboring or in any way favoring them. From the early years of the 18th century, there were a number of scattered Baptists in Virginia, especially in Isle of Wight County. Some of these sent an earnest petition to the General Baptist of London for ministerial help. In response, two ministers, Robert Norden and Thomas White, were sent out in 1714. The latter, back up, there you go. The latter died before reaching Virginia, and the former organized a church at Burleigh. It is possible that this and the other General Baptist churches had already been gathered before the arrival of Norden. Before 1729, there was also a church in Surrey County in close affiliation, it would seem, with that at Burleigh. Norden died in 1735. 2 years later, two more English Baptist ministers, Caspar Mintz and Richard Jones, came out to carry forward the work. The church at Burleigh was in a distracted and unsettled state in 1756 and appealed to the Philadelphia Association for a visit of brethren to set things in order. Newman records that there was much strife because of the local officials in Virginia. If you will recall, in the Trail of Blood, something was mentioned about the persecutions that came about in Virginia. If you remember that. All right, because of this strife and persecution, it may have largely affected the beginnings of Baptist churches in North Carolina. All right, we'll look at North Carolina. If Baptists appeared in Virginia during the latter part of the 17th century, as Morgan Edwards supposed, that he was a historian, they were probably driven by the severe measures referred to across the North Carolina border. We have no record of the formation of a church in North Carolina until 1727. Excuse me. When an organization was effected under the leadership of Paul Palmer, who had been a member of the Welsh Tract Church. You remember that one? And who was a correspondent of John Comer of Newport. There's another connection from the church that John Clark started and pastored to another one of the quite a few links from this church, this first church in Rhode Island, to several churches throughout the 13 colonies. We can find connections. From a letter written by this church to Comer in 1729, we learn that it was organized in 1727 and consisted of 32 members. It was located at Cowan County at a place called Perquimans. This was the only church organized during the present period. So there was just one church organized in North Carolina. Right. Connecticut, 4 churches were organized in Connecticut during this period under the influence of the Rhode Island General Sixth Principle Baptist. The first at Groton in 1705 through the efforts of Valentine Whiteman of North Kingston, Rhode Island, who became its pastor. The second at New London in 1726 in connection with the labors of Stephen Groton. The third in 1735 at Wallingford of persons who had been members of the New London Church. And the fourth church to be constituted, and the last during this period, was the Farmington, now Southington Church. So it had a name change from the time that it was organized to the time that Newman was writing this. There's always one in the crowd. Small bands of Baptists of the same type appeared in a number of other places. New York. In 1643, Lady Moody, who had adopted anti-pedo-Baptist views. Now, what does anti-pedo-Baptist mean? They were against infant baptism, yes. Left Massachusetts with a number of her friends and dependents for Long Island. On her way, she spent some time in New Haven, where she is said to have made several converts to her views. Among them, Mrs. Eaton, the wife of the first governor of the New Haven colony. and the daughter of an English bishop. Whoa. Mrs. Eaton gave much trouble to Pastor John Davenport, who labored earnestly to convince her that, quote, baptism has come in the place of circumcision and is to be administered unto infants, unquote. And she didn't buy that.
Obviously, this John Davenport was not a good apologist.
No.
But she was.
Apparently, in his mind, baptism only applied to men.
Yeah, there you go.
I mean, if it's in place of circumcision.
Yeah. The Muslims have their own circumcision.
I was going to say, there is,
Called mutilation.
there's
Yeah. Lady Moody took a patent of land from Governor Kife at Gravesend with the guarantee of, quote, the free liberty of conscience according to the custom of Holland, without molestation or disturbance from any magistrate or magistrates, or any other ecclesiastical ministers that may pretend jurisdiction over them. She was not only good at apologetics, she knew what she wanted. And knew what she believed and would have nothing less.
I wonder why the man didn't go about it like she did.
Good question. A number of other anti-pedo Baptists were from New England and elsewhere gathered themselves around Lady Moody. But they do not seem at this time to have formed themselves into a church. Francis Doughty, an English anti-pedo Baptist, having incurred persecution at Lynn and Taunton, Massachusetts, big wonder there, for denying infant baptism, was the first religious teacher in Flushing. After laboring for a short period, he left for Virginia in 1656. A paper on the state of religion in the New Netherlands, which incidentally was the name of New York at the time, drawn up by two Reformed clergymen in August 1657 and addressed to the classes of Amsterdam, gives a number of interesting facts with reference to Long Island at this time, which partly confirm and partly contradict some of the data derived from other sources. Mennonites are mentioned as being at Gravesend, who, quote, reject infant baptism, the Sabbath, the office of preacher, and the teachers of God's word, saying that through these have come all sorts of contention into the world. Whenever they come together, the one or other reads something for them. These so-called Mennonites were probably identical with Lady Moody and her followers. And these peculiarities may account for the failure of these anti-pedo Baptists to organize a regular Baptist church. The notice about Flushing is highly interesting. Quote, at Flushing, they have had a Presbyterian preacher who conformed to our church, but many of them became endowed with divers opinions. They absented themselves from preaching, nor would they pay the preacher his promised stipend. the said preacher was obliged to leave and repair to the English Virginias. This preacher can scarcely be other than Francis Doughty, whose anti-pedo Baptist views seem abundantly attested. The document continues, quote, last year, 1656, a fomenter of evil came there. He was a cobbler from Rhode Island and stated that he was commissioned by Christ. He began to preach at Flushing and then went with the people into the river and dipped them. This became known here. The constable proceeded thither and brought him along. He was banished from the province. Unquote. According to contemporary public records, this quote-unquote cobbler was none other than the distinguished William Wickington, pastor of the Providence Church. In November 1656, William Hallett, sheriff of Flushing, was arraigned before the authorities for having, quote, dared to collect conventicles in his house and to permit one William Wickington, actually Wickington, to explain and comment on God's holy word and to administer sacraments, though not called thereto by any civil or clerical authority. Also for having assisted at such meetings and accepted from the said Wickington's hands the bread in the form and manner of the Lord's Supper is usually celebrated. Next. Hallett was deprived of his office and fined £50. In other words, he stopped being sheriff, not because he wanted to. Wickington was fined £100 and banished. He was sentenced to remain a prisoner till the fine and cost of the process shall be paid. When it was ascertained that he was too poor to pay the fine, he was allowed to depart, with the threat of imprisonment till fine and cost should be paid in case he should return.
So basically, if he came back, he was just going to remain in jail till he died.
That's right.
Ain't they ever figured out that the Baptist preacher ain't got no money?
It was a no-win situation.
A still more stringent ordinance was enacted in 1662, providing for a fine of 50 guldens for being present at an unauthorized religious meeting, with a doubling of the fine for the second offense, a quadrupling for the third, and arbitrary punishment besides, which meant you had to pay the fine, but you might get whipped also. The stringency of the law would seem to indicate that the evils forfeited were becoming alarming. You don't say. About 1711, Nicholas Iris, a well-educated brewer of New York, invited Valentine Whiteman of Groton, Connecticut. We just saw him. One of the most noted General Baptist ministers of the time, to New York, and opened his house on Broad Street for religious services. Whiteman seems for years to have visited the city from time to time. In 1714, Iris and a number of others were baptized by Whiteman. It was the advice of some that the baptismal service should be private for fear of the mob, but Iris insisted that it should be public, referring to the New Testament words, "No man doeth anything in secret, and he himself seeketh to be known openly." Not exactly King James, because King James didn't get there at that time. Sorry? No. Absolutely. He waited on Governor Burnett, son of a famous bishop, and asked for police protection. This was cheerfully granted. The governor graced the occasion with his presence, and is said to have remarked after the baptismal service was over, "This was the ancient manner of baptizing, and is, in my opinion, much preferable to the practice of modern times." Now, what had come into existence? Sprinkling and pouring. That's what he's referring to. In 1715, Iris House was licensed as a Baptist meeting house. In 1720, he hired a separate meeting house, and in 1721 received a permit to preach under the Toleration Act from Governor Burnett, which begins, "Whereas Mr. Nick Iris Brewer, a freeman, an inhabitant of the city of New York, pretending to be at present a teacher or preacher of a congregation of Anabaptists, which has had its beginning about 5 years ago within this city, and has so continued hitherto," unquote. The recognition of the church and the ordination of the pastors seem not to have taken place until 1724, when Valentine Whiteman of Groton and Daniel Whiteman of Newport, there's another connection with Rhode Island, visited New York for these purposes. In 1728, a lot was purchased and a meeting house erected. Considerable aid was received from the Rhode Island Baptist, but a crushing debt was incurred. This, combined with doctrinal disharmony, almost wrecked the church in 1730. According to Iris, who left New York in 1731 to become joint pastor with Reitman of the Sixth Principal Church in Newport, quote, "Some of them deserted under a pretense of love to the principles of absolute election and predestination." Calvinist. Calvinism has plagued Baptists from the beginning. The church languished and became extinct before the close of the period, and that was 1740. About 16 Baptist families settled on Block Island in 1663, and without formal organization maintained religious services until 1772. That's over 100 years. Am I right? They maintained services by themselves. Sorry? Absolutely. When a Baptist church was organized, the only church that has ever existed on the island. About 1700, William Rhodes, a Baptist minister, appeared at Oyster Bay, Long Island, and a number were converted through his ministry and probably baptized by him. Sometime afterward, the date does not appear to be ascertainable, a church was organized with the aid of elders from Rhode Island. Here you go again. Probably General Baptists. And in 1724, Robert Peaks, a member of the church, was ordained as its pastor. So, conclusion. With the record of the New York churches, Newman concludes the early history of the Baptists from 1629 a while ago, is 1639 to 1740. We will conclude this part since we only wanted to consider the churches that were started at the beginning of the United States. Of necessity, I have only highlighted the more prominent events of this period. There is no way I could have included all of the details. I've just hit the highlights. Newman's work on this subject is vast, and so much that it would not be possible to look at all of his work on the history of the Baptist and United States. There are other volumes. So with this, we conclude our study on church history through the trail of blood.
You've been listening to the live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study of the Mayfield Drive Baptist Church in Smyrna, Tennessee. We invite you to tune in at the same time next Wednesday evening for another live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study. We would love to see your comments regarding this broadcast. You may email us at imbr@imbmpodcast.com. That's imbr@imbmpodcasts.com. Or you may write to us at International Missionary Baptist Radio, P.O. Box 1676, Smyrna, Tennessee 37167. That's International Missionary Baptist Radio, P.O. Box 1676, Smyrna, Tennessee 37167. Thank you for listening, and may you have a blessed day.